Within hours of their December 7, 1941 attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the Japanese military began its assault on the Philippines, bombing airfields, bases, harbors, and shipyards. The Bataan Death March was the result of a battle between the United States and Philippine Commonwealth and the Japanese Imperial Army. The battle lasted for 3 months, and on April 9, 1942, the United States and Filipino troops were forced to surrender to the Japanese due to starvation and disease, thus beginning the infamous Death March, where approximately 76,000 soldiers, 66,000 of which were American, were forced to walk 65 miles to be put into prison and labor camps. The Japanese military followed the Bushido Code, which essentially stated that surrender was shameful and death was preferable. Anyone who surrendered was considered a coward and must be treated less than human. Therefore, the recently surrendered American Filipino troops could be treated as less than human and consequently were. The march itself took place in Mariveles, on the southern end of the Bataan Peninsula, to San Fernando. The men were divided into groups of approximately 100, and the march typically took each group around 5 days to complete. Life during the march can best be described as absolute hell. The most prominent form of torture the Japanese used was something called the sun treatment, where all of the prisoners were forced to stand in a line in the blazing sun without any protection for hours. Those that tried to get water from water sources were bayoneted or shot, and marches would go for sometimes 16 hours at a time. While exact numbers are unknown, it is estimated that thousands of soldiers died due to beatings and torture from their captors before ever even reaching the camps. After 8 total days of walking, the march ended on April 17, 1942, when the group arrived at Camp O'Donnell, which was affectionately nicknamed Camp O'Death. Following the end of the march, the prisoners were packed into hot steel boxcars with barely enough room to breathe, much less sit down. During this 45-mile ride, men continued to die from heat and exhaustion while still standing up. Upon arrival, they were forced to march 10 more miles when they arrived at the camp, which was a former Filipino training base. "We will work you to death, as you are guests of the Emperor," a Japanese official greeted them in English. There were camps for Filipino soldiers and camps for American soldiers. Here, from April to October of 1942, thousands of men died of sickness and starvation. The camp diet was lugao, a watery rice gruel that contained fish heads, vegetables, and usually inch-long weevils. Some people ate the weevils for their protein value. The prisoners supplemented their diet with prison stew, which was made from anything edible that they were able to steal, such as turnips or dead rats. During that time, the American prisoners were divided into forced labor gangs and trucked throughout the Philippines to build airfields and roads. In 1945, U.S. Filipino forces recaptured the Philippines and freed the captive soldiers who were still suffering in the confinement camps. These soldiers would be impacted by the poor conditions of the camps and the mistreatment by their Japanese captors. About 1/3 of the prisoners died from health complications even after they were freed. Nobody technically won the march, but the United States suffered its largest surrender in American history at that battle, and it was a major loss for us in World War II overall. The story of the Bataan Death March has come to dominate the role that the Philippines played in World War II. The Japanese military had forced marches in other places it had conquered, and it worked to death thousands of British, Dutch, and Australian prisoners of war, but those atrocities did not make headlines until later. Even the United States government withheld details and news of the march as they feared the Japanese would retaliate against the captives. The Bataan Death March was another rallying point for Americans who were already furious with the Japanese after the Pearl Harbor attack. The war in the Pacific was far more fierce than the one in Europe in terms of brutality. After the war, many Japanese officers were tried and executed in war crime trials. The Bataan Death March was one of many crimes that Japanese officers and servicemen had to answer for during American occupation of Japan. However, strategically, the march did not have much impact on the course of the war itself. Today, the Bataan Death March is remembered both in movies and memorials. New Mexico honors the 1,800 New Mexican soldiers who were sent to the Philippines through a Bataan Memorial Museum and an annual Bataan Death March, a 26.2-mile commemorative walk held at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Now let's sum up what we've learned. The Bataan Death March was a war crime committed by the Japanese Imperial Army. American and Filipino troops were the victims of this crime. They were forced to walk 65 miles straight with very little food and very little water. The prisoners were subjected to beatings and torture as well as starvation throughout the journey. It took 3 years for prisoners to be liberated. Many of the Japanese generals were tried and executed after the war for the atrocity. Many survivors of the march died after being freed due to extreme malnourishment and underlying health issues from eating dead rats and weevils. Thank you to Britannica, History.com, BataanDeathMarch.org, and Ducksters.